How do you feel about buffets? Do you like buffets or do you stay away from buffets? Well, on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about the history of the buffet, and we're going to debunk a few myths about, two myths about where the idea of the buffet comes from. And you see these a lot around websites, and so I want to talk about that, set the record straight. And of course, we'll ask the cards of the Life's Potluck Buffet card deck. What's on offer for our work and lives today? I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And thank you, as always, for listening. All right, let me just clear the air about this one. The idea that somehow the buffet-style eating derives from the Swedish smorgasbord. If you speak Swedish, tell me how I did on that one. I've been practicing. That was on display in World's Fairs in the turn of the 20th century is not the case. Buffets were happening before then in the United States and elsewhere. Also, the idea that somehow something that happened in Las Vegas in the middle 20th century that created buffets there is somehow also important to the development of the buffet, other than the fact that buffets are associated with Las Vegas hotels and casinos traditionally. There is no real meat, let's say, to that story. In fact, you'll see in that story the same details as the invention of the first sandwich. If you'll remember this, the legendary story is that the Earl of Sandwich was gambling and didn't want to stop playing cards, and so had meat brought to him, cold meat, between two slices of bread so that he can hold it with one hand. That whole story, which again is a legendary story that gets repeated about the first buffet, that the person who came up with it in Las Vegas didn't want people to stop gambling, so they made it a light repast of sandwiches. See where I'm going with this? And that is why they started doing buffets in Las Vegas. But we have evidence of buffet luncheons from the 19th century involving sandwiches. And so I don't think that we really should put too much stock in that story about its influence on the buffet in the United States. It's clear that the buffet luncheon and the buffet breakfast became popular in the United States and elsewhere in the 19th century as a way to do service for a meal that did not involve a sit-down meal. So sometimes you see this called a standing luncheon. In some of the British sources, there's a description of a buffet luncheon that's called a standing luncheon. And that the idea is that you can sit or stand anywhere while you eat from the dishes that have been either set on a sideboard, which we call a buffet, and we'll get to that, which is really the heart of the episode later on. And so you have the dishes set on that buffet, and you're either served by people who are near the table, or you serve yourself. Both were options, seemingly, and that kind of easiness of having a meal where there's no formality in the sense of a seated kind of proper meal service as they thought of it in the 19th century, it would become more and more popular, especially around events. And in the 19th century, we see the rise of the buffet luncheon as part of events at hotels. For example, there's an example from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York where there's a buffet luncheon in the Myrtle Room, and that is part of a convention that's being held there. And we see this also as a very important part of not formal wedding luncheons. So it becomes, in the 19th century, a kind of option to counter the strictly formal wedding luncheon. So this is almost as part of the kind of relaxing of the formality around meals at events. And we actually see that in the 1880s, there's a fictional dialogue between two women debating whether it's okay to have a buffet luncheon or a buffet breakfast at a wedding. And there's a lively debate in this magazine called Table Talk. Now, so there's a lot going on in the late 19th century where buffet technology really is taking over the formal sit-down meal in various important event spaces. It's also the case that buffets were served on train cars, on dining cars. There's a buffet table that we see in the 19th century in some dining cars. And that is also part of this. And we see the same thing in the United States. The same thing is going on in Europe. And in fact, in the early, I think it was the 20th century, we see a buffet luncheon being explained to the members of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, where there's something is going to be followed by a buffet luncheon, and the Lords should signal whether or not they are going to be attending this buffet luncheon. So you could see that the buffet luncheon really made it not only to the kind of most convenient places like on a railroad car, but in some of the highest level of society dining, like a luncheon for the Lords of the House of Lords in the UK. So that is that kind of shows you the very rapid growth of the technology of the buffet luncheon in the 19th century. It happened very quickly. But where does this whole idea of buffet come from? Now, we have a kind of conundrum here insofar as the origins of the word buffet, meaning the meal thing, are not very clear, but I'll explain where that comes from. But the ultimate origin is not exceedingly clear. The same is true for a word that is spelled the same but pronounced differently in English, which is buffet. And buffet means to strike a blow. Early on, it seemed like striking the cheek was involved. In various Romance languages where this word or similar words appear, it is like striking a blow on the cheek. And so that is like slapping someone in the face or with a flat hand, right? That's what buffeting seemed to be originally. And there have been many efforts over the centuries to kind of connect the two, as somehow there must be some connection that is not at all clear. And for a very long time, the two had a parallel history. So let's go back in time and talk about the history of the buffet. We're going to have to go back to 1718, which is not by any means close to the first mention of buffet, but I think it'll be helpful to see the dictionary entry for buffet in what is the kind of authorized dictionary of the French language done by the French Academy. Now, that dictionary defines buffet, as well as two things. One, a kind of what we would call a dresser in modern American English, which is a piece of furniture used to store clothing. And it says that this is not the way that it is used anymore. So it's pointing to that as an old definition that was used for buffet. This is interesting because this is one of the only times that this supposed definition appears, and it's one of the only times it gets explained as not being used. However, the other definition that the dictionary gives is that the buffet is a table where you put your dishware and your glasses and your bread, all aimed at serving a meal. So that is the definition of buffet. That is a kind of key definition, and that it's a table where you put stuff to serve a meal. And this dictionary entry is one of the only ones, only older ones, where it actually talks about putting bread on the cupboard. So that's important because that's a piece of food used in the serving at that point of meals, in the same way that plates and so forth were important for the serving of meals. The older definitions in the 16th century, 17th century, tend to focus on the service, the silver service, or other services that you place on a table that's kind of to the side for the serving of a meal. That is the idea in English of a sideboard, and that's what we can still today call a buffet, although it's more often than not called a sideboard, because we tend to now just use buffet to refer to the style of meal served. Okay, so that is the kind of central definition in the 18th century in French of buffet. But as we go back in time, we start to see buffet connected to something interesting that actually relates to our later ideas of buffet. And the definitions in the centuries before start to focus a lot, especially the ones that try to kind of figure out what the etymology of buffet is. They focus a lot on the idea that buffet ought to be translated into Latin as an abacus. Now, when I say the word abacus, you probably think of the types that have the counters on them that you slide back and forth. The original meaning of abacus in Latin had to do with a board, and then it also had to do with what we would call a sideboard or a buffet at some point in time. Now, that word comes from a word that also is in Greek as abax, and there's a lot of also kind of bad etymologies for abax and abacus. A lot of them look to loan words coming from Semitic languages that have to do with dust. This is not the case, but it's not certain where exactly the word abax comes from. It might be one of these pre-Greek, as they're called, words that existed in those areas of the Mediterranean where before the languages that would become Latin and Greek had come on the scene in those spaces. So that is the abacus eventually became basically a word for a sideboard. And the sideboard is perfectly described as a buffet. And the buffet is where you put the wine cups and the wine and the just it's a place for drinking where the service of wine happens. And so a lot of the more imaginative um, etymologies connect it to that, connect it to this, what was apparently some sort of tax or tariff that was on drinking of wine in the tavernas, and that this was called in some places, maybe in France, in late Latin, something like a buffetaria, because that means that the buffet was already being called a buffet, unless, and this is where these etymologies start to say, well, maybe the idea of buffet is actually related to, in French, the words like boire, to drink. And the boire is hiding in its form. That's what we call the infinitive, to drink. But it's hiding within that form the root of the word, which is bouffe. And so the idea that this tax on drinking in taverns was a bouvetterie is alluded to very early on in the dictionaries of what the origins of words are in French. Now, that is interesting and possible, but it's a little tricky to explain why you have these parallel forms. Why do we have, for example, the word in French at the same exact time in the 1600s, for example, we have buvette, which is the word for I think today we would call it a lounge, where lawyers and their clients take refreshments, or in the case of the French Assembly or Parliament at that time, the place where apparently judges were able to get refreshment. So it's clear that there is, and it's still today in French, buvette is still a refreshment related word. A refreshment bar can be a buvette. So that is as old as buffet. Now the question is, why are there these two parallel forms, and how did that V and that become an F if it's that same thing? So that's really the sticking point. And at this point, we kind of lose the thread. Now, all of the other ideas that buffet comes from, words that have to do with buffet or blow or puff, that is kind of, I think, wishful thinking in terms of coming up with a reason for that. The original forms of buffet have one F, and later on it becomes two Fs. So I don't think that they're probably related to any of those words that have to do with slapping or cheeks, or the side part of a helmet that protects your cheeks, or, well, there are a lot of darts thrown at buffets in history, though maybe not so many at actual buffets. Now, the interesting thing is that there's always this idea in French that there's this word in Italian, buffetto, which is maybe connected somehow. The problem with the Italian connection is that, again, there are two Fs and two T's, and it just doesn't seem like this is going to be the loan word. Honestly, if you had to ask me what the actual source of the word for buffet was, I'm going to tell you I would look, and I think this is where the answer probably lies, in 16th century Spain. Because in Spanish, bufete as a desk starts to crop up in the 15th century. And can still mean desk today. And that whole idea that it comes from the Spanish language, as we would call it now, there's something probably more likely to be coming in that direction to France. That's my thought on the matter, but we lose the thread really in the 1500s as to where and why the buffet, as we know it, as a piece of furniture, arose. All right, well, let's ask the cards for their thoughts about our lives and work today and see what's on offer. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us somethings. Oh, it's card number 9. Bad managers and leaders are great for showing how to do it right. You never learn more about team management and leadership than by being stuck with a bad supervisor or leader. Study what they do and how it makes you and others feel. Then do the exact opposite. Easy, right? So if you are a leader or a manager, consider how you are responsible for the problems you may put on others, and then change how you approach things yourself and do the opposite as well. So think about that today, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.